Hi, and welcome to the RubySorce podcast. Today I'm joined by Dan Langevin, who's based in the US. He is CTO at Ideon. Dan, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. So, as always, start by asking a bit more about you and how you started working in programming and a bit more about your background. So, yeah, tell me a bit more about that and also how you started working with Ruby.
Sure. So I didn't come from a traditional software development background. I did some development, learned how to program a bit when I was a kid and in high school, did some websites and that sort of thing. But when I went to college, I actually studied organizational psychology. So didn't plan to go into software development. But I got into work with a consulting firm right after school, and they had some development that they did. So got kind of back interested in it there. And then from there, I moved into another role with a startup where I had a little more flexibility. Started to build a few things on the side for them, and that actually is where I first was introduced to Ruby. Was pretty early in the when Rails was starting to become popular. This is probably 2006, 2007.
Sure.
Saw all the screencasts of how you can build a blog and with generators and all that, and got pretty into that. So I sort of taught myself and used it for practical purposes for stuff that I needed to do in that job to build some small scale systems, mostly around collecting leads from our marketing team and that sort of thing. And then from there, I decided that I really wanted a position where I was a full-time engineer. Moved into work for another startup who didn't use Ruby. I was PHP and a couple of other languages that there was mixed in, and was there for a number of years. Kind of learned the craft of software development there, but always really was pretty interested in Ruby as a language and Rails as a framework. Just a lot of it made a lot of sense to me in the way things are approached.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I moved into to start my first company, which was a company called Lifebooker, we were working in Ruby on Rails, and really kind of doubled down on it at that point. So been doing it for a number of years. Enjoy the language and the framework, and it's I think there's a lot of good things about it. Downsides as well, just like everything. There's pros and cons, but I
Absolutely.
think
Yeah.
for me the pros outweigh the cons.
Sure. And now you're CTO at Ideon. Tell me a bit more about Ideon and what you guys do and yeah, that sort of thing really.
Sure. So Ideon is an API middleware company, and what we do is connect insurance carriers. So insurance carriers for medical insurance, dental, vision, accident, critical illness, disability, all these types of coverage that in the U.S. are typically purchased through your employer. So your employer will buy the policy and then provide it to you as an employee.
Sure.
So connecting those insurance carriers, and most of them have what you would consider legacy systems. So systems that were built usually in the 80s or 90s. They use EDI and flat files to transmit data. There's very little validation or transactionality to the way they present their data. And then a sort of new generation of technology companies that are focused around member experience, employee experience, HR systems, benefits administration. So all the sort of user-facing aspect of insurance, purchase and management, and this is both on the individual market here, where people are buying for themselves, and more so on the group space where it's going through an employer. So those companies are looking for a modern API that has transactionality that they would interact with the same way you'd plug, a Stripe or a Plaid into your app and
Yeah.
expect that things just
Mm-hmm.
work the way the way you would expect them to. And
Yeah.
that's actually a really big challenge in the insurance space just because of those legacy systems. So what we do is we sit in the middle, we provide those APIs to the more tech forward companies, and then we work with our insurance carrier partners to create the type of transactionality and validation around the exchange of data that the tech platforms are looking for without having to really modify their existing systems. So we sort of improve on the input and output of their existing systems in order to create that kind of experience.
Okay. And how are you finding, well, not how you're finding, but what's the pros and cons around scaling a Rails code base?
Mhm. So one of the sort of a core tenet of Ruby and Rails is that developers should be allowed to have sharp objects, meaning that there's a lot of flexibility and you can do a lot of things in Ruby that you might not be able to do or be a lot harder to do in other languages.
Yeah,
It doesn't give you as much structure as some others do, and that's good when if you know what you're doing, and not so good if you don't know what you're doing. So one of the things that we've found is that having a fairly strong core of experienced Rails engineers who know how things are typically done in a Rails code base is really important. So having less experienced engineers be the bulk of your team, it can be really challenging without those kind of strong you know a strong enforcement of a particular pattern that we get in some other frameworks. That's in terms of how do you think about the structure of the code base. And there are a lot of if you look at like Shopify, and there are libraries that they've created and introduced, and there's other fully open source stuff that is in use that provides some level of that structure, so you can see kind of the need for it. In terms of the performance of the application itself, it's pretty interesting in that in my opinion, the trade-off between developer experience and productivity versus runtime performance is good for Ruby on Rails in the vast majority of cases. And in the cases where it's not, we do have another tool that we reach for, which is Rust in our case. So
sure.
um, we have some types of transactions we need to process. So I'll give you an example. We do rate calculation for insurance, so it's fairly complicated, and it needs to be done for hundreds of plans and potentially thousands of people in a single request, and we want to have that come back within a couple of seconds. And so implementing that in Ruby, there really wasn't a way to get those calculations to be fast enough. But what we were able to do was build Rust libraries and integrate them via FFI, so that we can actually drop into a lower level language and break outside of the global interpreter lock and use all the resources on the server, calculate everything really quickly, and marshal it back into a Ruby object that can be rendered. That is, it's a bit of a left turn. It takes a little bit of work to get that in and working. But once you have that tool in your toolbox, so to speak, for those really performance intensive operations. It turns out there really aren't that many of those types of things. And the productivity gain you get out of building everything else in Rails. For example, some of our admin screens, some of the simple API endpoints. That benefit vastly outweighs the cost of having to get a little creative for some of the really performance intensive pieces.
And these are some of the performance sort of bottlenecks that you've run into, right?
They are, yeah. So, the rate calculation is a good one. We have extremely large files that we need to render. So when in those cases, what we will typically do is build out a microservice that just does the performance intensive thing. So there's sort of two flavors of this, right? There's the things that need to be returned synchronously in a response, that we would typically reach for a compiled Rust app that gets built in and called via Ruby. If it's a really standalone thing, we might integrate that over a queue, and then have the more performance intensive piece being run asynchronously. We use AWS step functions, for example, for some very large data processing jobs that Ruby's not a great choice for. But ultimately, it gets pushed back via everything's kind of analyzed, consolidated. It gets pushed back via an API into the core database that is running our API that's user facing. So we're able to manage that integration in that way as well for asynchronous jobs.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned AWS. That was something that I wanted to talk to you about, because I know that when you and I have spoken, obviously prior to today, I know that you've moved from Heroku to AWS. What are the pros and cons of that?
Hmm. So the oh, back up a little. So we're in the process of fully moving off of Heroku and onto AWS. And Heroku
Yeah,
has served us very well for the time that we've used it. I really like the platform. I think they were sort of ahead of their time, and what they built is really really impressive. We've been using their HIPAA compliant product, which did a lot of the heavy lifting for us when we were earlier stage that it would have been very, very difficult for us to do ourselves. So that actually has been really great. The sort of limitations that we ran into are there's a couple. There's one, the cost. It is significantly more expensive than running on a similar type of just on core AWS, which
sure.
itself is even more expensive than having your own hardware. So it's quite a bit more expensive than the cheapest you could do it for. We
Yeah,
think that AWS is sort of a good middle ground for us. The second piece that we've run into is just the flexibility of compute versus memory on different types of applications. We have some that are more compute heavy, some that are more memory heavy, and just don't have that many options in Heroku for instance size that would really allow us to sort of optimize our usage. So we end up either over allocating, which goes back to that first problem of cost,
yeah,
or under allocating, and then we're bumping up against memory limits, or we're getting CPU bound. Things are slowing down. So those are sort of the two reasons that we made that investment to move over to AWS. But I will say that it was a significant investment. It took us about a year. We actually just have launched our first fully productionized apps in AWS. Purely, we're going to move everything else over the next month or so. Planning to sunset Heroku by the middle of the summer.
sure.
But there was a lot that Heroku gives you that we had to recreate. We had to recreate the way environments are spun up. So obviously your production staging, your sort of permanent environments, but also the whole pipeline for testing pull requests before they're merged, for testing them once they are merged, for managing config and environment variables, because we wanted to replicate all the 12-factor best practices that Heroku gives you out of the box.
Yeah,
And that was a non-trivial effort for our DevOps team and our engineering team in order to get everything in a state where we could feel comfortable moving it over to AWS, and that we weren't losing a lot of the things that Heroku gave us.
sure, sure. And when do you think it's time to break the app up?
Yeah, so this is it's an interesting question, and this is thinking through. Almost every company starts with a monolith of some sort, and some companies keep a monolith forever. So the answer for them is it's never time to break it up.
Sure.
In my opinion, there kind of goes back to how you think about dividing up your teams and how you think about how you create value as an organization. Right. So what we try to do is we look at what we call value streams. So like, what are we trying to deliver to a customer? A customer being sometimes it's internal customer, sometimes it's our paying external customer, sometimes it's a partner. So sort of user of our software. And so we try to organize our teams around those value streams. And we might, early on, it's, one team and it's end to end. There's probably only one real value stream or maybe two. So they're maybe covering everything. But as you start to scale out, well, now maybe we have, a couple of value streams and there's a team kind of like owning each one end to end. Now, as we start to scale up a little bit further, we might have a team that handles one piece and another team that handles another piece of kind of the same value stream, and they're chained
Sure.
together via sort of contract, right?
Hmm.
And so that's how you think about kind of scaling up this structure of the team. And I think that the structure of the code, it's really important that it mirrors the structure of the team. And so what I mean by that is that each team owns their production environment and owns their code base. So where I think have run into the most challenges, at least historically, that I've seen, is around having many teams trying to operate in a single code base, and especially if they're working for various purposes and different value streams. And then it starts to get pretty messy. So the ideal state, and you're not going to always be in this state because you're growing, you're changing, you're moving things around. But if for ideal state is every team has sort of a clear piece of the value stream they're responsible, has clear inputs and outputs for every other team, and owns their own infrastructure and code base, right? And so that's the model that we try to trend towards, right? So that's not to say that it's always the most important thing that we do at any time, and we always stop and say, okay, we have to break this team in two. Let's break the app into two. That's not the case, because there are times that's not the right decision. But just as a guiding principle, that's sort of how we think about the structures of our code base.
Cool. Okay. And what's some interesting things that are happening at Ideon at the moment?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of interesting projects. We're pretty rapidly expanding our carrier relationships. We've got a number of large carrier partnerships that we'll be announcing in the coming months. We've got a number of large tech platform partnerships as well. So we talked a bunch around plan and rate. So the quoting piece, we talked about enrollment, which is the eligibility for individual members, sort of like if you have a change, how does that get to the insurance carrier? We also have a product around what we call decision support, which is finding a doctor that accepts your plan, or a plan that your doctor accepts, depending on which part of the workflow you're in.
Sure.
And in the U.S. health system, there's a lot of variety in which plans an individual doctor can see. So it's actually pretty big and important decision piece here.
Yeah.
So we've got a handful of really big partnerships happening there, especially on the tech side. So some pretty big names coming on board. And when we do that, when we add new carrier partners, especially, there's an integration piece that our team takes on, because we're sort of helping them to move forward and modernize without having to build a lot of things on their own. So there's a fair amount of work involved in all of that.
Sure. And if you're bringing on new clients and that sort of thing and integrating with other people, does that mean that you're hiring for your team?
Yeah, so we've been expanding the team, probably not as aggressively as we were, a year or two ago, given the overall environment, which I think everybody is feeling. But we've had
Sure.
good solid growth. As we add more integrations, the number of changes in maintenance obviously goes up. So we have a staffing model that supports that. And a lot of our growth now is kind of like doing what we do better, adding more nodes into our network, as compared to lots of new features and that sort of thing. But definitely adding staff, as we scale up there.
Sure. And what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you if they're, interested in hearing more about Ideon, or if they're interested in working for Ideon, or, generally just having a chat with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think my email, so it's dan.langevin, LANGEVIN, at ideonapi.com. That's the best way to reach me.
Perfect. Dan, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure to chat to you and understand more about Ideon.
Yeah, it's been great speaking with you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.